lived for 5-6 years in the Northwest Territories, and over the last 25 years I've done most of my research and worked very closely with Indigenous peoples in northern Canada and the Northwest Territories, Yukon, Nunavut, and northern Alberta. Very honored to have learned a great deal from those relationships, and still have very important connections and relationships to communities where I used to live. One, and I'll just throw this out there, some of you may have seen it or been interested. I used to live in Insecurity, which is a community on on Great Slave Lake in the Northwest Territories. And this morning I was watching a video link to the Equator Prize, because which is a United Nations award for communities, organizations that have contributed to sustainability or conservation of resources. And Insecurity last year was successful in negotiating a national park in their traditional territory. And so this morning was invited to be part of that group, in which members of the community received the Equator Prize. So that started off my day great, to see friends of mine. Yeah, so happy and so honored for their great work internationally. I can send you the link to that. I'm going to be sharing some more specific examples of work that I've done over the last few years, and perhaps more specifically to the oil sands region, giving you some more examples from work in that area, and trying to tie it to some global trends and patterns as well. I'm currently a member of the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, in which we're conducting a follow-up assessment on biodiversity and sustainable use of wild species. So a huge part of that work focuses on sustainable use of wild species and their social, cultural, health and food security benefits to Indigenous peoples. So I'll try and touch a little bit on that as well. Oops, as Brent probably has already given you multiple examples, but food security is defined, of course, as access of all people at all times to enough food for an active, healthy lifestyle. So this is a definition that comes out of international organizations that do work at global levels, like the FAO. But we also recognize that food security is a concept that it is culturally constructed. It has different meanings in different places for different peoples. And the factors, of course, or the determinants of food security vary significantly. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about different constructs of food security as they may be defined within Indigenous communities that I've been honored to work with. And then also talk more specifically about some of the factors or determinants of food security that are playing out, that are influencing or are variables that affect food security for Indigenous peoples here in Alberta. If any of you want to jump in and ask questions orally, or feel free to interrupt me. I don't have my chat window open, but I noticed there's a, as Brent said, yes, the Equator Prize is a big deal. So it's pretty exciting. Moving back to my slide deck, wanting you to recognize some fundamental differences in how we think about food security for a lot of land-based peoples, but particularly for Indigenous communities that I've worked with over many years. We spent a lot of time in our faculty certainly talking about agriculture and the importance of agriculture and supply, demand, markets in supplying sufficient food resources for an urban population. But certainly Brent's work and other work that's been done in our department and my work with communities in Northern Canada recognize that there are traditional food systems that are critically important to food security. And by traditional food systems, basically mean informal production of foods that have cultural, nutritional, economic value, that the production of that food isn't something that's hived off as a separate activity, but is very much integrated in the way of life of a particular community. So an example of, hunting caribou in northern Canada, it is about food production, but it's also an expression of culture. It's how people share knowledge with future generations. It's an expression of sovereignty over lands and resources. It's a way that people connect to their spiritual values and their beliefs. So it's important to recognize, we're talking about food, but it's part of this broader system of beliefs and practices. So in most of the communities that I've been working with over a number of years, there's an interrelationship between market and traditional food systems. So most communities depend partially on market foods, partially on traditional foods. As you would imagine, the dependence on market foods is driven, or increasing dependence on market foods is driven by many factors. If you compare, what's happening, say, in Nunavut, in some regions of Nunavut, versus what's happening here in northern Alberta. Inuit communities that I have worked with, say in the Baker Lake region or the Key Lake region of Nunavut, depend very, very significantly on caribou, as well as fish resources from Baker Lake, as well as marine resources such as whale from the Hudson's Bay. When we think about the distribution of or the relative dependence, First Nations Métis communities here in Alberta, although historically would have depended to the same degree, like 70% of their protein coming from traditional food sources, people no longer have access to resources like caribou, like elk, like moose, for a variety of reasons. Declines in the health and abundance of fishing resources in places like Lesser Slave Lake, have hugely undermined what was a very strong traditional food system. So when we it's important to recognize these big picture historical and socio-political and ecological drivers. We can say, well, Indigenous people in Alberta don't really eat traditional food. Why is that, right? Why? First of all, that's not true. People are still able to maintain a healthy diet based on moose in a lot of places, or deer meat. But there's lots of context and history around why traditional food systems are not as prevalent perhaps in regions like Alberta when compared to areas further north. We're also concerned with, of course, questions of food insecurity, and there's a variety of reasons why, and I just alluded to some of those that are bigger picture ecological, historical, sociopolitical drivers. Lack of access to lands and resources. Lands and resources in this part of the world were taken up or taken for settlement and use by non-Indigenous peoples. There are affirmations or agreements signed between the government and organizations like Treaty 8, First Nations, the Dene, Cree, and Métis communities that ensure or give legal rights to continue to hunt, trap, and fish, etc., that are critical to food security. But as I mentioned, that those rights, those issues of access are undermined in many ways. So we're in a situation here in Alberta that there's a significant amount of food security among Indigenous communities for a variety of reasons. In other regions, like in Nunavut, food security is also a different kind of problem, and a different problem again, say when we're looking at, say, the food insecurity of Quechua people in Peru, who I'm working with on another project, or Indigenous people in Mali in North Africa, or say Maori communities in New Zealand. So it's important to recognize the place context, you know, all of the socio-political, economic, cultural factors that go into determining whether a particular community is food insecure. So in some areas of the world, right, we recognize food insecurity as something that presents as being undernourished or underweight. But it's also a question of lack of nutrients and the nature of the food and whether or not it's contributing to circumstances of chronic illness. So as you would know, here in North America, you know, the rates of type 2 diabetes are increasing, or have been increasing significantly over the last 2 decades. You know, it's a crisis in many communities, type 2 diabetes, and it's certainly a crisis in Indigenous communities. So we're seeing particular kinds of manifestations of food insecurity, like chronic disease, like type 2 diabetes, as really something that needs urgent attention. A lot of that, the prevalence of, and the rise of type 2 diabetes is, I've lost my picture. What did happen to my picture? There. A lot of the explanation as to why people are food insecure in a lot of Indigenous communities in Canada has to do with this interplay between traditional and country food and market foods. So this is a picture of a colleague of mine from Lutzelgay. He's harvesting a caribou, and that population of caribou, the Bathurst herd, has declined over the last 15, 20 years from 475,000 animals to less than 10,000 animals. The reasons behind that significant decline are complicated, have to do with interplay between climate change and resource development and natural cycles in that population. But nonetheless, you know, people are experiencing food insecurity as a result of that decline in caribou. The replacement opportunities, what are the options for you know, alternatives to caribou in that region? People have many alternatives. So on Great Slave Lake, you know, people set more nets, people hunt more moose. There's also a significant muskoxen population in that area, which some of you may be astonished to, if you saw muskox, it kind of looks like a prehistoric animal, but it is a huge amount of meat. And for some reason, as caribou populations decline, muskox populations actually increase. It's a habitat competition issue. But in Lutzelgay, people have a lot of alternatives and have adapted to these cycles of caribou population decline over many generations. In places like Northern Alberta, my friend Cleo Reese is from Fort McMurray First Nation. What are the alternatives to? You know, the moose population has declined significantly as a result of many factors, including habitat loss. You know, there are no alternatives in terms of fishing off the Athabasca. The population of whitefish there is considered to be unsustainable in terms of supporting the food security of local Indigenous communities. There are very few alternatives in regions that are significantly impacted by resource development. So there's an automatic or unfortunate imperative then to depend on market foods. You can see on the shelves, and maybe I'll open it up to comments here if people want to unmute themselves. What do you see on the shelves there, and why do you think that's what's on the shelves? This is actually a picture that was taken in Lutzelgay, but it could be from Fort McKay or it could be from from Polytech, or it could be from Kuujjuaq. What do you see on the shelves, and why do you think you're not seeing other sorts of things on the shelves? Anyone?
Yeah, sorry, I'll chime in here. I'm actually from Fort McMurray.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, so I know like Fort Mackay specifically, which is like an hour north of Fort McMurray. To my understanding, doesn't have a grocery store, just a convenience store.
That is right. You stole my punchline, which is
sorry.
That's okay. That's perfect. I'm glad you took it. I'm glad you took it. That's perfect. Sorry, Caitlin, I didn't want to cut you off. Did you want to chat a little bit more about this picture? I was just searching people's ideas about what's on the shelves and why. Does that represent food security when you look at that picture?
Yeah, I think part of it too, sorry, just to go a little like off of this a bit, I know there's also a community called Fort Chipewyan, which is also north of Fort McMurray, and it's only accessible during winter when they build the winter road. So I know a lot of, at least my understanding for a lot of these Indigenous communities is to have non-perishable food. And chips is obviously a more affordable non-perishable. So that's where I would guess that a lot of it comes from. And also the fact that it's a convenience store and they tend to carry mostly junk foods and foods that aren't as nutritious. But for a lot of people, being able to afford anything, even if it isn't nutritious, is better than like not eating.
You summed it up perfectly. I'll hit all three points, which is in a lot of communities, there is no access to a Costco or a Safeway, right? That there are small grocery stores that may or may not be economically able to supply fresh produce, right? Fresh milk. They're fly-in communities that, for economic reasons, need to produce or make available non-perishable items like the chips and the pop and etc. So that's exactly it. And the third issue being that a lot of stores, as well as people, live kind of at a poverty line in many places, and so you're kind of looking for fast, cheap calories instead of something that takes a little bit more time to prepare or is more expensive to purchase. So, you know, I have pictures. When I do this lecture live, I actually have a picture of a watermelon that's $75. I've been to Fort Chipewyan a few times this year, earlier in the year before the lockdown. Took some pictures of, the cost of food and chip is crazy, even crazier in some other areas like Igloolik in Nunavut, or in communities in northern Manitoba or northern Ontario. So it's critically important to understand this interplay between traditional country food and market foods, and understand the drivers as to why people are food insecure, and not really just to focus on individual personal behaviors in terms of thou shalt eat more carrots and milk. The question is why aren't people drinking more milk and eating more carrots? A, it's not culturally appropriate. B, there's a whole set of social, economic, ecological factors that are driving that issue. So this is just a bit of a schematic to kind of think about.
Brenda, there was a question about canned goods.
Yes.
Do you find canned goods on the shelves in those stores?
You do, and canned goods are an important food, but it's also a weight issue, right? Bringing in canned goods into some places, like it's weight on an airplane, so it's non-perishable for sure. So you'll find lots of ready-made, and it's it's better now than it was, say, when I was living in Saskatchewan in 1995. What's available in terms of canned goods is healthier than it used to be, but it's a weight issue as well when you're trying to ship in food.
Thank you.
Yeah. This is a little schematic. I've actually done a lot more work, or kind of a lot of the emphasis of my work has been around environmental resource management into our natural resource management, and then the ways in which, you know, we think about the health and sustainability of caribou or fish populations, right? And then what are the implications? You know, are we managing those resources in ways that recognize food security, recognize their value to people, or are we managing caribou as, you know, a Disneyland kind of icon that we want to protect so that, you know, tourists can visit the wild, or so we can take pictures from our trucks on the highway. So that's kind of been a particular interest or area of research of mine in recent years, and understanding kind of the ways in which natural resource management and local livelihoods are interconnected, and then the implications of that for food security are important. Just to give you a bit more background around the statistics, these are slightly old, but are not necessarily much different. 2/3 of households with children in AREC have experienced hunger in the past 12 months. AREC is in a community in Nunavut. It's one example of, you know, the kind of stories or the kind of experiences people have of food insecurity. It is coupled with a lot of other kinds of indicators of poor health. And that's kind of one of the challenges in thinking about food security as a kind of nested socioeconomic and health issue. I used to teach a course in the Faculty of Native Studies on Aboriginal health. You know, we start out by looking at the statistics from Health Canada, and for almost every indicator of health, Indigenous communities are painted as in poor health or in need or in crisis relative to the mainstream population of Canada. And it's problematic to do so, to present all of these negative statistics, because it suggests that people are in a constant state of crisis and vulnerability, you know, rather than looking at the capacities and strengths that exist within AREC or in Fort Chipewyan or Fort McMurray. We tend to overemphasize, perhaps, when we're talking about Indigenous communities, the problems and these adverse statistics. So I throw that out there as a bit of a caution in terms of how I'm presenting this data at the moment, and I'll try and get to the other part of the story later on, thinking about health and well-being in a more positive light. But it is important to recognize this tremendous inequity that exists within Canada, whether that's drinking water, whether that's access to healthy foods, whether that's access to education. You know, food security, food insecurity is one of many variables of inequity that as a society we are going to have to come to terms with very quickly. And it's heartbreaking and shocking that we still haven't addressed these issues, but have known about them for decades, right? So what are the solutions to food insecurity in Indigenous communities? That's where I'm headed. Some of the ways that we track food insecurity or changes in health and well-being are by, you know, government indicators, and usually those are kind of the negative Nancy sort of stories. Governments tend to collect things like, you know, crime rates, sexually transmitted diseases, you know, number of children in care. So by virtue of, you know, government services that focus on problems or addressing problems, you know, a lot of the statistics that we have about Indigenous communities in the country are often these kind of service deficit oriented statistics. Some of the statistics that are not quite so deficit oriented and are kind of interesting to look at are self-reported health status, this is an example of self-reported health status, looking at Indigenous communities, Métis, First Nations, on reserve, off reserve, and compared to total Aboriginal population. Sorry, non-Aboriginal population on the right-hand side. So there's some comparability or similarities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. When we're looking at self-reported health status, we don't necessarily see those same kinds of presentations of deficit. That there's a much more comparable or similar kind of narrative that comes from self-reported health status. There's a bunch of questions in the chat. Maybe I'll catch Brent on those later. I just spending a bit more time talking about the value of traditional foods. Country foods, they're sometimes called, we're including in that wild meats, so proteins from hunting. Caribou, I talked a lot about here in Alberta. Moose and deer and elk are important ungulates to the diet of Cree and Dene communities in northern Alberta. We've just finished sending a publication, or sending in a paper for publication based on 10 years of survey data with 38 communities about harvest levels, harvest and consumption of wild meat. And we're doing that in the context of the spread of chronic wasting disease, which is a disease affecting deer and elk in the province, and trying to assess the degree of risk that exists for communities that are highly dependent on that source of protein. Fish here in Alberta, not as important a source of food now as it was historically. We have another project called Tracking Change, in which we're looking at the significance of fishing practices as well as fish resources to the diet and livelihood of communities right along the Mackenzie River Basin, or right along the Mackenzie River, which most of you should know is one of the largest watersheds in the world. It starts north of Edmonton and drains into the Beaufort Sea. We're working with 40 different communities in that basin, in which we're assessing the relative value of fish. So we compare, for example, Paulatuck or, a Clavic, or which is in the Gwich'in settlement region, also part of the Inuvialuit settlement region. Compare, tremendous dependence on fish resources in a Clavic, or, other communities in the Inuvialuit region. When compared to our friends in the Lesser Slave Lake area. For anybody from Slave Lake, I realize I'm running out of time, Brent. I should shut up and keep moving. Maybe I'll just open it up for questions at the end. My point being that Lesser Slave Lake is a really interesting and tragic case study of why traditional foods are not as prevalent in the diet of Cree and Métis and Dene communities now. Trout were extirpated from that lake in the 1930s as a result of mink farming and commercial harvesting of fish for sale in Alberta and south of the border. So essentially, starting in the 1930s, if not before, livelihoods locally were undermined in that area. So it's important to look at the very specific kind of ecological, sociopolitical context of different traditional food resources. And understand why these traditional sources of food are no longer part of local diets or livelihoods. This slide attempts to again revisit this idea that traditional foods are part of an Indigenous food system that includes market foods and includes traditional practices like hunting, like fishing. There's a variety of reasons why, I just gave some, why traditional food systems are in decline or being undermined, in, not only in Alberta, but internationally. Things like loss of access to land, a lot of Indigenous people's rights are not recognized here in Alberta or internationally. Working with communities in Brazil as part of another project, Indigenous peoples are being forcibly removed from areas of traditional use, if not killed as a result of, trying to prevent their land from being taken away and used for other kinds of uses like soybean farming or any number of other kinds of commercial development, mining by Canadian mining companies among them. These are some, very specific place-based stories. Certainly larger drivers like climate change, a big factor looking at the declines in Aboriginal food systems globally. I'll just skip over a few more slides. I kind of got carried away talking about some examples, but when we, the fundamental point being that, declines in traditional food system, creates economic stress for people who have to buy food instead of harvest it from the land. It also creates increased health risks as a result of, switching to market foods, which are nutritionally less valuable to communities, and also creates any number of other kinds of cultural, spiritual, emotional traumas or grief as people lose access to those resources. I was doing an interview this morning with a newspaper about the extirpation of the Malign Lake caribou herd in the Jasper National Park area, and important to recognize how these losses, like the extirpation of an entire herd, which is a harbinger of other potential extirpations of herds in that area, and other wildlife, it's a emotionally, culturally, and spiritually extremely painful and problematic on so many levels. And we have to sort of think about where we are at in our society, that kind of recognition of, oh, it's too bad that caribou herd's gone. A lot of us look at perhaps caribou as a Disney character and not necessarily as something that's part of people's livelihood and well-being. So, reoriented how we think about traditional food systems is critical. Changing availability of access on a global scale. The Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity Ecosystem Services really highlighting over the last year with the release of their report on biodiversity, that globally Indigenous communities have greater and greater limitations in terms of access to food resources from the land. So that's a critical point that we're at as a species, as a planet. What does it mean when we lose a caribou herd like the Malign Lake herd? Is that a small issue that we think is not going to affect our lives? But when you look at these individual stories, it's not only Northern Alberta, it's in Labrador, it's in Northwest Territories, other species in other countries. We have to, when we look at it at that global scale, start to realize the real tragic impact that our current approaches to natural resource management are having for food security and health of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people.
Brenda, could you, there's a question about how extirpation of the Malign Lake herd in the Jasper National Park, how was that allowed? How did that happen when the national park would not have hunting?
So that herd was one of many herds that were recognized as endangered or threatened by CSIWIC, right? So you can probably answer your own question, or somebody else can probably answer that question. What are some factors that would lead to the decline or extirpation of the Malign Lake herd? We know it's not hunting. What would be the cause there? Anyone want to jump in? development in the area, right? So that species of caribou, unlike barren ground caribou, that species requires a lot of old growth and a very large expanse of habitat in order to sustain their population. So in Alberta, we see significant habitat fragmentation. Jasper National Park is just not large enough to, you know, when we see what's happening, anybody been to Jasper National Park lately, you see what's happening in terms of the disease of pine and spruce in that area, and the extent to which those systems, due to fire suppression, you know, are no longer as healthy as they had been historically. You know, caribou can no longer survive in those kind of degraded systems. And outside of the park, you know, with so much habitat loss, there's virtually no old growth left. And so the reproductive capacity of the herd, or the number of reproductive females, just declines to a smaller and smaller number every year, to the point at which that herd's no longer sustainable. So habitat loss is the critical issue, as many of you are pointing out. I probably don't have time, Brent, to go into my nice story about the oil sands, but I will just flip through my slides. How much time do I have?
So let's just hope to pause. So it's 2:48. We have until 3:20 in total. I think I'm going to stop this recording and then we'll start again. So just to break this up a little bit, or others, this can be too heavy to load. So I'm just going to